speaker is Professor Dileni from Department of Economics and Statistics, University of Peradeniya. She currently leads the initiative to promote postgraduate teaching and research in gender economics at the University of Peradeniya. To give you an idea of the format of the webinar, first Professor will conduct the presentation for about 40 minutes, and then we will move towards the Q&A session, which will be joined by Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mr. K.M.M. Siriwardena, and Assistant Governor, Mrs. T.M.J.Y.P. Fernando. For the Q&A session, please direct your questions in writing through Zoom as well as in Facebook page, and we will try to accommodate questions as much as possible during the 10 to 15 minutes allocated for it. So, without further ado, let me invite Deputy Governor, Mr. K.M.M. Siriwardena, to conduct the opening remarks of the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shanika. Once again, on behalf of the Center for Banking Studies and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, I would like to warmly welcome Professor Dileni Gunawardena for this webinar. I thought of giving a brief introduction to the subject, given its importance in the current context of the country. So as you know, the gender perspective looks at the impact of gender on people's opportunities, social roles, and interactions. Gender is an integral component of every aspect of economic, social, daily and private lives of individuals and societies. So therefore, policymakers must be mindful of the many aspects of socially ascribed gender functions and the specific needs of men and women. If development policies are to be sustainable, they must consider existing gender disparities in employment, poverty, family life, health, education, environment, public life, and decision-making bodies. So the successful implementation of gender policies affects the impact of gender, and in fact, in turn, it influences the process of social development. So at the same time, gender inequality is a persistent feature of the public and policymaking spheres. As Sri Lanka steadily emerges from COVID-19 outbreak, policymakers are seeking ways of resetting the current growth process with the intention of building a fairer and more inclusive economy. So in line with this, one aspect which will be centric in sustainable socio-economic progress of Sri Lanka is the gender equality. For long, we have taken immense pride in achieving gender equality in education and health indicators. However, these achievements cannot be reconciled with other aspects of gender equality such as wages, unemployment, labor force participation, and even the participation of women in senior corporate management and politics. So other emerging gender-oriented issues in Sri Lanka are the higher female life expectancy of women in the context of aging population, vulnerabilities of female-headed households, and gender-based violence. So notably, in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index 2020 rankings, Sri Lanka is ranked 122nd out of 153 countries, which highlights the importance of seeing socio-economic issues with the gender lens. Sri Lanka stands to greatly benefit from gender mainstreaming as well. The integration of gender perspectives in public policymaking can elevate the quality and social relevance of policies, as it makes policies respond more effectively to the needs of all citizens. So all these factors underscore the importance of the gender in many aspects. In this context, I think today's topic is very important to have a closer look at the same in order to understand why gender matters and how it has contributed and will contribute to the overall development, particularly in Sri Lanka, going forward. So I think we are very lucky to have Professor Dileni Gunawardena with us today to discuss this very important topic. So with that, I would like to kindly invite Professor Gunawardena to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. With that, I will invite our speaker today, Professor Dileni Gunawardena, to conduct the presentation. Passing on to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Central Bank and the Center for Banking Studies for inviting me to present on this topic. And thank you very much to our chairman, Deputy Governor, Mr. Srivardhana, for that introduction, which I think really made clear the importance of today's topic. So without much ado, let me share my screen. We have today's topic, Why Gender Matters, the contribution of gender perspectives to economic theory and development research. And that's who I am. That is today's date. And this is, we are not physically at the Center for Banking Studies, but this is where we are. So to begin, I wanted to actually introduce some of the contributors to gender analysis in economics, and this is by no means comprehensive, but I want to show that actually we have different types of contributors. On the left side of this slide, we see people like Nancy Folbray, Diane Elson, the logo for the International Association for Feminist Economists. And these people have been addressing and exploring gender issues for a very long time. The magazine cover that you see there is from the 1970s. But at the same time, there have been other researchers, development researchers like Esther Bosra, Amartya Sen, and one of the most recent Nobel Prize winners, Esther Duflo, Seema Jayachandran, who's with JPAL, and then we have the Gender Equality and Development, World Development Report of 2012, sort of showing the other side of people who explored gender, applied economists. And there are many more people than of this, of course, who have contributed. And as we go along, you will not see their faces, but you will see some of their contributions. So the outline of what I would want to talk about today includes first looking at some of the dimensions of gender inequality and the costs, then looking at some core principles and concepts, and then looking at many contribution of gender economists to the area of unpaid work, female labor force participation, the economics of the household, economic growth and gender responsive budgeting. And then finally, we get to the summary. So talking about the dimensions and costs of gender inequality, I will talk about inequalities in the labor market, in asset ownership, in poverty, and in actual mortality. And then I'll present some estimates of the costs of inequality. So this slide shows us that labor force participation has been either stagnant or even in some countries it has been declining, though in other regions it has been increasing. But overall, globally, labor force participation has been stagnant. And we know that in our part of the world, in South Asia, it has in fact been declining. We also see earnings gaps between men and women. And this chart from this map from the World Development Report 2012 shows gender gaps in some countries of the world for salaried workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs. Sri Lanka is also one of them. And we see that earnings gaps between men and women across these countries and in these occupations are quite considerable, right? So from women earning 12 cents per dollar for every dollar that men earn in Bangladesh, and that's in entrepreneurship, to maybe 82 cents in Egypt, which is the highest women's wages relative to, well, in salaried workers relative to men. Women are also less likely to start enterprises. So what we have here are total early stage entrepreneurial activity rates. And these are basically activity rates of people who have either just started an enterprise or within the last several months. And in 48 economies in 4 geographic regions, we see actually that the likelihood of women starting an enterprise is much lower than the likelihood of men starting an enterprise. And of course, there are a variety of reasons for this, which also show underlying inequality. When women are wage workers, they are more likely to be poorly paid. So if we look at the incidence of full-time low-paid workers by sex, we can see again that the blue line, which is that of women, is much higher than the yellow line, which is that of men, right? So this is the incidence, right? The proportion or percentage of women who are low-paid, full-time low-paid workers. Women are also more likely to be informally employed. So if we look especially in the developing world, we see that there is a great proportion of women who are informally employed. And not only are they informally employed, but they're also likely to be in precarious work. 1 in every 25 female wage earners are employed in domestic work. And of those 67.1 million domestic workers, 11.5 are actually migrant domestic workers who may be even more precariously positioned than domestic workers within the country. Now we move to asset ownership, and this graph shows that women are less likely to be sole owners of land than men. So if we compare sole owners of land, and this is the 45-degree line which shows us equality, we can see that almost in every country in the world, with the exception of Cambodia and Comoros, I think, there's a much higher proportion of men who own land than women. If we take poverty, we see that young girls, that is children really, and women in the reproductive age group, women in their most fertile years, are likely to have higher poverty rates. This is from a report that was jointly produced by the World Bank and UN Women in 2018. And when they actually worked out rates of poverty by gender, and not just by the gender of the household head, they found that there was a considerable gender gap in poverty rates in these specific age groups. But not only poverty, but women are also have a greater likelihood of being in time poverty. So if we look at the time spent in both paid and unpaid work, and we look at the regions of the world, and we look at the first column, which is that of women in each of these groups, the first column is taller, with the exception of this, which is the Americas. But everywhere else, the first column is taller than the second column, and globally also that is the case. So women work more, right? They may work more hours per day than men, and so their time poverty is also greater. And then finally, women are simply not there as they should not be. In other words, there are almost 4 million missing women per day, missing women per year. And this shows the figures by age group. Amartya Sen was the first person to draw our attention to the concept of missing women. That is a woman who should be there, but who is not. In other words, excess female deaths in the world, right? And this is as large as 4 million per year. Okay, so why do we care about this? Why do these inequalities matter? We can think of two types of reasons. The first is intrinsic reasons, because women are also humans, right? And so inequality matters. But the second is instrumental reasons, and these reasons have actually come into the conversation much more in recent times. And that is that this inequality has an economic cost. And so if we remove this inequality, it's better for all of us. Here are some examples. If we take labor market productivity and the potential increase in output from women's greater and better participation in the labor market, we can see that that would be a direct benefit from removing inequalities in the labor market. Similarly, if we give women access to resources like land, that will increase their productivity and it will increase total output. Then researchers found that money in the hands of women is more likely to be spent on food and children's education. And so there are intergenerational effects of giving women more control over resources and over income. Now, the costs of gender inequality have actually been estimated by various people, but perhaps the best known is this September 2015 report produced by the McKinsey Global Institute. And they calculated that something like 28 trillion dollars of additional annual GDP could be brought in by 2025 if countries in the world were able to reduce their gender inequality to the full potential scenario. So the full potential scenario is to bring it to the level of the country with the least gender inequality in the world. And if that happened, that could increase global GDP by 28 trillion. And to give us an idea, 28 trillion is equivalent to the combined GDP of US and China. Now, if the full potential scenario cannot be achieved, if each country was to get the potential of its best neighbor, right? If they match the best in region country in progress towards gender parity, then 12 trillion could be added to global GDP. And that's twice the likely contribution of women to global GDP growth in the business as usual scenario. So we see that there is a strong economic case for gender parity. Now moving on to some core principles and concepts. The difference between gender and sex. Now when we talk about gender equality, I teach gender economics at both undergraduate and postgraduate level, and I speak on gender in many forums. And one of the things I come across is that people think that when you say gender, you are talking about women. And then if they have come to the point that gender is not talking about women, then they will think that we're talking about men and women, right? But actually gender is talking about the social relations between men and women. So when we talk about men and women, we are really referring to sex. We are referring to the biological attributes that define being male or female. So that would be, the sign that we would commonly see in bathrooms would indicate that this is a man and this is a woman, right? But gender is referring to the socially given roles, activities, needs, responsibilities, and characteristics connected to being male or masculine or female or feminine in a society at a given time. And so I have shown these two symbols in pink and blue, because that is what we do, isn't it? We associate pink with being female and blue with being male, and that is where the social aspect comes in. So here are some examples of things that are different because of sex and things that are different because of gender. So on the left side, we see women can get pregnant, men cannot. That's a fact of life. It's a biological fact of life, right? Women lactate, men cannot. Men can grow beards, women cannot. On the right side, we have here some that I have chosen, but there are many more that we could include. Women usually do more of the unpaid work in a household than men. Women are less assertive than men in bargaining. In general, women earn less than men, as we saw. And all of these are not coming out of the biological difference, but they're coming out of the social difference. And in a sense, that is what underlies gender inequality. So if we could say that gender is a social construct, meaning that the biological differences between females and males are interpreted by society to create a set of social expectations that defines appropriate behaviors, determines access to rights, resources, and power in society, and leads to unequal outcomes. So gender inequality, shown here by the relative sizes of these symbols, is unequal treatment or perception of individuals based on their gender. And it arises from differences in socially constructed gender roles. Now, before I go further, I will just talk a little bit about what's meant by a gender lens. So when we talk about gender, there are some, or what we mean by gender studies or gender economics, which is my area. Some core principles. One is that we focus on human well-being as the defining metric and not so much on GDP. There's a concern for inequality in the distribution of resources and power. So both these two matter. And most importantly, we focus on the role of unpaid reproductive or care work for both well-being and the functioning of the market economy. And we emphasize that economies are constituted of both the paid and unpaid spheres. Furthermore, we say that economies are gendered, and the gender division of labor between the paid and unpaid spheres underlies gender inequality. So this is the circular flow of income that many of you probably saw in your first year undergraduate or perhaps even A-levels. But here's it's a little bit expanded. We have the business sector, we have the household sector, we have included the public sector and non-profit institutions. But something we have done here is also identified that there is paid and unpaid work in each of these in different degrees. So we have in the household sector, we have paid work, but we have unpaid work, we have subsistence work, and we have care work. In non-profit institutions also, we have formal paid work and volunteer work. And in the business sector, we have formal paid work and we have informal work, mostly paid, but perhaps some of it might be unpaid. And the important thing is that these are gendered. So mostly we would find women working in the spheres that have a large proportion of unpaid work and men working in the spheres that have a large proportion of paid work and especially formal paid work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that unpaid work is not work or is not important. So this picture is from the cover of a book by Nancy Folbray called Who Pays for the Kids? Gender and the Structures of Constraint. And this shows that just as you have the market over here and men going into work every day and coming out, right? You also have a conveyor belt here of work that takes place in the household, right? Of refreshing, of care, of reproduction, right? So there's, feeding children, ironing clothes, and so on, a lot of care work that takes place over here. So let's look at unpaid work and care work. And the important contribution that gender economists made in this regard is to point out or to collect evidence that unpaid work creates value. But it is invisible. It's invisible to policymakers. And I'll talk about this a little more as we go on, especially when we talk about gender budgeting. This has repercussions for who bears the brunt of certain policies. And the last point is that gender segregation in unpaid work restricts women's choices. So we will find women facing certain problems or employers having problems when it comes to hiring women. because of this gender segregation. So ultimately, it is the gender roles in society that lead to this issue. Now, the most recent, well, I think the first time use survey nationally that we have for Sri Lanka, 2017 final report, shows that in Sri Lanka too, we have this imbalance between genders when it comes to unpaid work and care work. So we have 87% participation rate of women as opposed to 59.7% of men. And we have similarly between caregiving and unpaid domestic activities, a similar discrepancy between participation of men and women. And over here, we look at not participation, but actual time. And we see almost 6.5 hours of women who are actively engaged in housework and care work, as opposed to men, which is 2.5 hours. But that is just of people who participate. If we take the average across the population, including people with 0 hours, right, we find that the gap is actually quite larger. It's 1.5 hours for men and 5.6 hours for women. So we do have quite a gap there. Now going into the labor market, I want to talk about some specifics in terms of gender and labor market. And the first one is, what is discrimination? And I like this picture because it captures the point of what gender discrimination is. We consider, say, a gap in wages to be discrimination only if it is between otherwise identical men and women, right? So like men, only cheaper, right? So women and men are given different treatment than men by employers simply because they are women. That would be discrimination. This has been my area of research in Sri Lanka. And I have found that actually there is discrimination in Sri Lanka between men and women. But men and women are not otherwise identical, right? There is one difference, and that is that women can get pregnant and men don't. Men cannot. And what happens is that women tend to face what we call a marriage penalty, and men often face or benefit from a marriage premium. So we see here that over time, once women take a break to have children, they end up in a lower trajectory, earnings trajectory than men. Now, very quickly, let me go through 3 things. These are actually from my undergraduate labor textbook, but this is showing you that this is actually mainstreamed, part of mainstream economics, but it's gender analysis, right? And this is looking at how women choose between market work and domestic work. So domestic work, working in the household, right? And they will choose domestic work as long as the value of that domestic work given by the shadow wage is higher than the market wage. So if we just compare SW and MW, we will have domestic hours of domestic work determined at HD. Right? If market wages increase, we would have women choosing to engage in market work more and reduce their domestic work. But if something happens, like having another baby, that would cause your curve to shift, and you would then have a higher value of the shadow wage, right? And that would cause you to engage more in domestic work, right? Now, let's go to the next one. And this is from a paper by Francine Bloor in 1991. And it shows that though we are used to the concept of reservation wages when we think about labor force participation, we think that everyone has a reservation wage, and if the wage offer is greater than that reservation wage, they will take the job. But we also find that there is this concept called reservation utility. And in this example, Bloor indicates it in terms of hours, right? So here, somebody would be, would need to be compensated by higher wages if they have to work longer, and would be willing to take lower wages, even if they're lower than the reservation wage, if the hours are shorter. So this might explain, for example, why many of my graduates would prefer to be teachers working not just shorter or not even necessarily short hours, but more flexible hours, right? Hours that coincide with their children being at home, for example, than to work in a high-paying job, which requires them to work long hours, right? And this would be gender-related because of many things, because of cultural norms, which talk about, how we feel about women working, because of the actual work that women do, the unpaid work that they do. So for both these reasons, women would show this kind of behavior. A third graph that I want to show from my labor economics textbook shows how the same relative wages for men and women can end up with three different sets of combinations. In this first graph, we have a man and a woman. In all three graphs, we have a man and a woman, a couple. And we see that the preferences in this household are towards leisure. And so we find the man working part-time and the woman not working at all. In the last one, we see their preferences is towards purchase goods and services. And so we find both are working full-time. And in the second one, we see a situation that's in between. Now, I have used this to show that you can actually have this kind of graph explaining female labor force participation if we think of the preference for leisure as a preference, as the household's preference or society's preference for women not working or working, right? So let's move on to looking at the whole idea of whether there is such a thing as household preferences, or whether there is actually within the household different people with different preferences, and whether there is bargaining that takes place within the household. Now, this slide actually talks about some of the feminist economics contributions to household models. And these two papers were early contributions towards the cooperative bargaining models of the household in the 1980s. At the same time, you had Strauss, Singh, and Squire, who are not feminist economists, but who came up with agricultural household models, which many of you would be familiar with, which pointed out that production and consumption are both take place within the household, and that they're not necessarily separable, right? And then, of course, as we said, valuing unpaid work and time use was also something that was a contribution of feminist economists. Now, this is from explaining the Nash bargaining situation in a cooperative bargaining model. And the cooperative bargaining model has been used within gender economics to explain what takes place within households. And the most important point, perhaps, that has come out of it is that within households, there is what we call the threat point, which is determined by each individual's fallback position, right? And the important conclusion that came out of bargaining models is that the final allocation depends on this threat point. So if you could influence the threat point, or the outside option, you could actually influence how resources are allocated within the household, how bargaining takes place, how decisions are made in households. So this was an important conclusion for household bargaining and for gender and for development, people working in development who are thinking about gender. Collective models are a different kind of non-unitary model, in which allocations within the household depend on a sharing rule that can be derived from the data. And finally, you have non-cooperating bargaining models, which show that households don't necessarily reach Pareto optimal outcomes. In other words, it's possible within the household to improve one person's position without hurting anybody else's position. And I will show you some research that showed this. But here I want to talk about why these findings were important for policy. So, first point is about how we think about preferences and resource pooling. If we assume that people have identical preferences and the pooling of resources can lead to policy failure if household members have different preferences, resources, and responsibilities. And this Haddad, Hodinot, and Alderman were people who came, who showed this in a 1997 paper. Then when we talk about public transfers and the effects of public transfers, they depend on the identity of the income recipient. So households, for example, may reallocate resources away from the transfer recipient to compensate for the transfer receipt. If there's time, I'll talk a little bit about this. Policy initiatives and information, we may address to one person in the household, but they may not be shared with other household members. Sometimes that may work positively towards getting the household, getting the policy outcome we want, but other times it may work negatively. But there are also many policy levers if the household doesn't act as one. So if we have different possibilities, there are many more things we can use, many more things we can do if the household doesn't act as one. Okay, here are some examples which I hope will make the previous statements clearer. This is evidence for bargaining models and showing that there are different preferences within households. So in a 1990 paper, Duncan Thomas showed for a national sample of Brazil that wife spending improves health, nutrition, and education of children, and unearned income in wives' hands improves nutrition and child survival. Hodinot and Haddad showed similar results. Income in the hands of women increases the budget share of food, and it decreases the share of alcohol and cigarettes. Esther Duflo, in a paper that I think is titled Grandmothers and Granddaughters, explored the effect of a post-apartheid expansion of the pension system in South Africa, which was received by grandmothers, and it improved the health status of granddaughters, right? So showing that identity matters in terms of who gets and who benefits, right? Now here's an example which is quite well known, and this is pointing out really the fallacy of thinking of household as a unitary household, that it acts in concert with each other. Rather, the household is a place of conflict where there is bargaining and where there may be unutilized resources because of this. And Udry's result really was that fertilizer and labor were not allocated efficiently across men's and women's plots. It was possible to reallocate from men's plots, both fertilizer and labor, to women's plots and increase total output. And if this were done, then the household would have a greater yield, which would then bring them a greater income. So reallocating resources would lead to both efficiency and equity. So this was one of actually the early studies, but there have been many studies that have shown similar results in this area. This study by Fleischner shows that intra-household dynamics can impact a spouse's ability to meet the needs for capital. Husbands can limit working capital available to wives by restricting access to family funds, making it difficult to go to financial institutions or participate in committee meetings, not helping them to pay membership shares, and not granting access to property that can be used as collateral. So thinking in terms of, when lending to women or when promoting entrepreneurship among women, thinking of them just as women or thinking of them as belonging to a household that is behind them and supporting them can lead to too much optimism, right? And rather, some kind of clever policy design that takes this into account would be more successful. The extent that husbands can enforce their preferences depends on the strength of relative bargaining power. Now, these were all micro examples. Let me go to a macro example, and then I'm almost done. So when we think about macroeconomics, I think many of the people in your audience are probably from a macro background, and they will remember the swallow model and the endogenous growth model. And when we talk about the growth model, we have this N, right, which stands for population or labor. But who is responsible for producing that labor, for both the quantity and the quality of labor? Now, if you think especially about the outcomes of these models or important points in these models, in the Solar-Swan model, it's the importance of labor productivity. And in the expanded version, in the Mankiw-Romer-Weil growth model, the endogenous growth model, human capital is what is important. And in recent times, James Heckman has pointed out that quality early childhood development heavily influences health, economic, and social outcomes for individual and society at large. Basically, Heckman has shown that things that happen in the first 2 years of life really determine outcomes in later life. And who is really responsible for an individual's growth in the first 2 years of life? So here's actually a paper by Ageno and Canuto, and I'm going to go to their model and explain it in those terms. Ageno and Canuto use an overlapping generations model, and they look at how access to infrastructure services can improve children's health and education. So looking at the pathways through which this works, it works through, if you think of children's health and education as the outcome of a production function, the inputs into that production function are the time allocated to child rearing, and then the other things that go into child rearing, the physical inputs. But the time allocated is very much a time allocation of women, right? And women's health and education, there's a lot of research that has shown this, has an impact on their own children's health and education. So if we think of these two, and we look at where women's health and education comes from, and we think of, or we go to this model which allocates 4 uses for women's time. Women could allocate their time to home production, which we have seen happens a lot. They could allocate their time to their own health and education. They could allocate their time to child rearing, and they could allocate their time to market production, right? So access to infrastructure services by reducing the time inputs that are needed to produce the same output can vastly improve, reduce the time, and vastly improve both children's health and children's education. Women's health and education, as well as children's health and education. And women's health and education then improves their productivity. It improves their contribution to market production. It increases their wage incomes. It increases their share of family resources and therefore gives them more bargaining power in the household. So there is a sort of a multiplier effect here, right? As well as by reducing, by access to infrastructure, reducing the time allocated to these, there's more time that can be allocated to market production, right? Now, if we look at some of the things that are mentioned here, we see gender bias in two places, and that is gender bias in market production means that women only get a fraction of their productivity as wages, right? If you read Canuto and Aguinaldo, that is one assumption they have made, and that assumption is based on fact. As we saw, there is a large literature showing that women do face discrimination in labor markets, right? And then the other area of gender bias is in child rearing. So there is research that shows that whether it is mothers or fathers, there is discrimination that takes place in terms of bringing up children, in terms of inputs into children's health and education, that boys are favored over girls, right? So we see that for this to change, so access to infrastructures can actually improve children's health and education, but we need a lot of interventions in related markets, and it is a long-term process. Finally, the last topic that I will look at is gender responsive budgeting. So what is gender responsive budgeting? It's not a special budget for women, but it's an analysis of how all areas of spending impact differently on men and women. Who's able to access services? Who pays for what? Now, these are 6 tools that can be used for gender responsive budgeting: policy appraisals, beneficiary assessments, public expenditure analysis, tax incidence analysis, analyzing the budget in terms of time use, having a medium-term economic framework, and a budget statement. If we look at this graphic, it brings all of these together. And what we see is that policies have a different impact on men and women, because women are more likely than men to have responsibility for unpaid work, which reduces their time available for paid work and other things. It also means that, say, you have an expenditure cut on social protection, right? Or you have a shock like we did, and most of the world has had because of the COVID pandemic, right? The people who will be picking up either the fact that social protection is not enough, or that spending cuts have taken place in some countries, right? But mostly because that it is not enough. Disproportionately, that will be women. But women earn less, and they have lower incomes, and they have lower wealth. And as a result, women are likely to be paying less taxes, right? So this is another side. If you have a policy of tax cuts, right, women are not going to benefit from tax cuts, right? Then the idea that income may not be shared equally in households, as we have seen very clearly. And as we know in Sri Lanka as well, and unfortunately it hasn't changed much in the recent past, women continue to be underrepresented in public life. And therefore, government policies don't take women's needs and priorities sufficiently into action. And this leads to policies that fail to meet the needs of women. So to summarize, what I have shown you is that gender inequality is pervasive, it's all over, and it's persistent, it continues. Gender is a social construct that leads to unequal gender outcomes. Unpaid work creates value, but it's invisible and it restricts women's choices. Men and women have different preferences. Threat points or outside options influence intra-household bargaining and its outcomes, and households are not always Pareto efficient. Gender bias affects economic growth. Government budgets affect men and women differently, and all of the above have important implications for policy design. Thank you very much. And I think perhaps we are now at the time of sharing questions. And we have several questions. Some long questions as well. So let me, I think I can afford to take, I was asked to restrict to 3 questions. And I think I will answer them as much as I can. So gender issues in education sector, does the popular single gender school system in Sri Lanka contribute to gender equality or inequality? And that's a very good question. I'll answer it by saying that studies in the UK have shown that when women are from single-sex schools, they are more likely to display leadership qualities or especially competitiveness. They are less likely to be afraid of competition, right? Than if they are from mixed schools. So it's possible that Sri Lanka's single gender school system, the school system is not single gender. Some schools, especially national schools, are single gender. But many of our Madhya Vidyalayas and Madhya Mahavidyalayas are mixed schools. So I think going by the English research, we can extend that to think that certainly some of the discrimination, some of the socialization that takes place in schools, especially in mixed schools where boys might be preferred over girls, doesn't happen in the single schools. Okay, let me take another question. In terms of decision making in leadership positions, is it enough to have numbers, or is it necessary to have overall decision making to be a more feminine approach? For example, use concepts like empathy instead of efficiency. That's an interesting question, and I think certainly numbers is not enough. We need substantive representation, not just nominative representation. So numbers are not enough. I am partly sympathetic to the idea of having what the person suggests here of a more feminine approach, but I'm also being an economist, I value efficiency, right? But I think the point that is made is because for so long men have dominated the world of work, there are certain values that come to be appreciated and held up as important values like efficiency, right? And certain other values which are just as good for the economy, right, that are not valued. And in recent times, there's been research that shows that diversity, having these different values, having the perspective that's coming from a feminine kind of perspective, can actually lead to innovation, it can lead to creativity, and it can actually then lead to an improved economy as well. There's a question that's been put. Commonly, policies are implemented to ensure that a certain percentage of women are chosen for work and hold cooperative responsibilities. Due to this, some women who may not be capable are chosen to fill these vacuums. Are there any other ways to overcome gender inequity? So this is a really good point. And I'll give you the answer from the most recent sort of research debate, which essentially says that if these differences in women, right, is coming out of socialization, then we have to address that. We have to change socialization. So if nurture is the problem, then that's what we have to change. So we have to have, more single-sex schools, or encourage women to have leadership qualities and so on. We also have to change the workplace, as the previous question pointed out, so that we look at other values that are just as important, right? Let me also point out that one of the most important pieces of research that has come out in recent times is that men are more competitive than women, but they may be competitive to the point beyond their competence. So basically, you may find that men are hired because they are more competitive, or men are promoted because they are more competitive, but actually women are more competent. So actually none of the research complains about women not being competent enough, right? And I would think from a statistical point of view, since you have fewer women, you're more likely to get good women, right? Who have sort of come through, been filtered through the process, as it were, than that you're likely to get bad women, right? So I will leave that answer. I'm sure it may not have satisfied the listener, but I will leave that answer there. And I would like to take this question. Thank you for your very informative and simple presentation. Is there a course I can follow in Sri Lanka to learn more about the link between gender and economics? Absolutely. At Peradeniya, we have something which we call GAP, that is Gender at Peradeniya. And that is, we offer 3 courses in our master's programs. And I have put the link here to the master's pgihs.lk, that stands for Postgraduate Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at Peradeniya. And if you click on this link, you will get you will hear about our gender course. You can also email us at this email address. So please, I would be delighted to have, we teach these 3 courses, and they're part of the master's program. They can be offered for anybody who's doing any taught courses in their research degrees as well. So I think perhaps with that I will stop. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your invaluable insights with us. Now I kindly invite Assistant Governor, Mrs. Fernando, for delivering remarks and set the tone to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Shanika. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Gunawardena, thank you very much. It was very informative, and you conveyed your messages in a very simple manner where anybody could understand. Being a lady I also contribute to the views expressed by you with certain numbers. So when it's shown with research and with numbers, we have to accept this situation. And this is about the women participation, women empowerment, women leadership, the diversity, all these, we've been speaking about these things for a long time. I think now what has to happen is we need to do something, because you very rightly showed there is an impact on the economic contribution also. You gave us some numbers to say 28 trillion, so that contribution, the loss of contribution. So I think it is up to all of us to get together, because from time to time we have seen different policies have been initiated towards getting the women participation, getting the contribution, and reducing these gaps and all that, but they have not been continuing. They are not being long lasting for whatever the reason. So what I feel is the culture has to change first. The perceptions have to change first, because as you quite rightly said, a different type of work is expected or allocated, or even going beyond that, it is considered as being the sole responsibility. So when a woman is expected to attend to those responsibilities, I think it is quite natural these kind of gaps and differentiations happen, and the potential is not known, potential is not harnessed. So therefore we tend to go maybe to look towards the men, for what we have seen that they have been kind of taking the leadership and being more involved. So in my side, what I can say, not being a researcher, you have shown with research data this situation, but what is important is for us as women, together with men, to take this forward to overcome this situation. Because as I said, continuing and doing something that can really take this challenge forward is what is important. And when it comes to the central bank, of course, or at least even my own life, I would say I have not really felt that, that I'm at any point, I haven't felt that I'm being a lady. I have seen other ladies also like taking challenges and going forward, but I'm sure if we look at the country at large, or maybe the Asian region, or maybe several other countries, the larger population, the women population, tends to go through what you have shown in the numbers. So collectively, together, we have to take it up. I'm sure our other counterpart understands it. So they will also join with us to go through this, and we have to make that change. We are now looking at a lot of different things in this new normal situation. So I think this also should be another addition to the set of policies that we take forward, because with numbers we have shown a big difference can take place if we join, if we reduce these gender gaps and have the diversities and promote more gender participation in the normal activities like men. I think that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Professor, if you wish to add something on AJ's remarks, you can do so.
Very briefly, yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Fernando. I think you came to the crux of the matter, that what really has to change is culture. Sometimes in some countries that has been done in different ways. One way has been the use of quotas. If something is forced on us, then culture changes in relationship to the quotas. Or people look for solutions. So for example, I know that in the corporate sector, when parent companies of multinational companies, when parent companies impose quotas, then HR is forced to think of creative ways of solving the problems of women so that they can hire or attract and keep more women. So that's one area. The other area that has been from countries as different as Brazil and India, something that has been successful is actually teledramas in changing culture. So I wish that we had more teledramas that instead of portraying sort of the traditional woman or the victimized side of women, showed women who were making a success of being, working mothers, showed men who were contributing more to unpaid work in the household and so on. So that's just two sort of examples of things that the literature has shown. And I think I will stop there, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think that is one more way in which we can make a change, simply by talking about it and making people more aware that, this gender analysis is actually something quite serious, and we can approach it very seriously. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Well, now we have come to the end of the session. Let me invite Deputy Governor, Mr. KMM Siriwardena, to conduct the closing remarks of the session.
Thank you, Professor Gunawardena, for making that very enlightening presentation. I think you highlighted very clearly and made some important suggestions to address the same. And you touched on both the micro level as well as macro level issues in the subject of gender. And we were able to understand findings of empirical research on many aspects. So when it comes to the macro level solutions, I think access to infrastructure, as you highlighted with many aspects, is one of the highlights of the lecture or the presentation. Also, the final part, at the final part, you touched upon the need for the gender responsive budgeting, which can play an important role, particularly in the policy making. That said, in fact, the need for taking women's needs in policy making was also highlighted. And as you mentioned, all these factors have important policy implications and needs specific attention going forward. As Ms. Fernando highlighted, this need continued attention to the policies that were highlighted. So with that, once again, on behalf of the Center for Banking Studies and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, I wish to thank Professor Gunawardena for sharing your knowledge through a simple but very comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation today and answering the questions that came from the audience. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, sir. So with that, we conclude today's webinar, and I would like to thank again Professor Dileni Gunawardena and Deputy Governor and Assistant Governor for sharing your insights and valuable time with us. Finally, my heartfelt thankfulness goes to all participants for being with us, and hope to see you again in another CBS event very soon. Thank you.